With Bina introduced to the game, Childe gained a new type of team that can be played. One built around one of the newest reactions added to the game, Lunar-Charged. Today we'll be exploring what are Childe's best Lunar-Charged teams, how to build and play them, and learn some of the nuances that'll come from using them. But before we get into that, let's first talk about the Lunar-Charged reaction that these teams will be centered around. First off, Lunar-Charged works differently from regular Electro-Charged. Lunar-Charged can only be triggered if you have certain Nodcry characters on your team, and in this case, that's by having either Ineffa or Bina on your team. Without them, you cannot trigger the Lunar-Charged reaction. Second, unlike the Electro-Charged reaction where your damage is calculated only by the character who last applied the element, Lunar-Charged calculates its damage by using the stats of every character who is part of the reaction. This means Lunar-Charged will be using the level, elemental mastery, and crit of any character who applies Hydro or Electro for the reaction, and this applies if you have multiple characters applying the element. Third, Lunar-Charged calculates its damage by adding up the damage dealt from its strongest to weakest contributor. The highest contributor keeps 100% of its damage, and then second highest adds half of its damage to that, and then each additional contributor adds a 12th to the final number. And because each contributor can crit, sometimes your best Lunar-Charged character doesn't crit, and your new highest contributor will be someone with less stats, and you'll get a weaker Lunar-Charged reaction. This makes crit rate the most valuable stat to have when calculating for Lunar-Charged damage. So the priority of stats for the Lunar-Charged reaction will be in the order of character level, crit rate, then crit damage, and lastly elemental mastery, having the lowest impact in the damage formula. And the final thing to know about the Lunar-Charged reaction is that it's affected by hit lag. Hit lag is a mechanic that freezes the enemy every time you hit them with a melee attack to mimic the weight of an attack. This also has some interaction with various other mechanics, like extending the freeze duration or extending your own buff duration. The more you hit an enemy, the more delayed your next Lunar-Charged reaction will be. By default, without hitting the enemy, Lunar-Charged triggers every 2.1 seconds. With Childe constantly hitting the enemy, Lunar-Charged can be delayed to triggering once every 2.3 to 2.5 seconds. This small difference in proc rate means we're getting about one less Lunar-Charged reaction every 2 rotations. It kinda sucks, but it's also not a big enough problem where it significantly affects your DPS. It's about 6% less Lunar-Charged damage on average, so it'll affect your team's DPS differently depending on which Lunar-Charged core you use. And there are 2 types of Lunar-Charged cores that can be played. The first is an Ineffa Bina core that focuses primarily around reaction damage. And the second is an Ineffa Xilonen core that focuses on off-field damage with Lunar-Charged helping boost the team's DPS. Starting with the Ineffa Bina core, this team focuses around reaction damage over personal damage. If you don't have Bina, Ino can be used as a temporary replacement. This team will be all about putting every buff on Ineffa in order to maximize your DPS. And in order to do that, you need dedicated artifacts for your team. Ineffa will want the new Morning Star set, which will give her some EM and buff her Lunar-Charged damage by 60% if we have Ascendant Gleam, which we'll be getting by using Ineffa with Bina or Ino. Bina will want the Silken Moon set to give your team 120 EM and to buff lunar reactions by 10%. Childe will usually want to use the Night Sky set in order to give himself a massive crit rate buff in order to compensate for his lack of buffs. In addition, you'll also be buffing your lunar reactions by another 10%. But if your 4th character buffs Childe's damage a lot, like for example Xilonen, Childe can also use the Nymph Dream and you'll get almost identical team DPS. Your 4th can be anyone who buffs Ineffa or contributes off-field damage. Fortunately, or unfortunately depending on how you see it, because over 50% of your team's damage will be coming from the Lunar-Charged reaction, no matter who you pick, the team performance will be very similar to each other due to the lack of buffs towards personal damage. And similar to other teams focused around transformative reactions, the Ineffa Bina core has a high damage floor with a limited damage ceiling because reaction damage makes up the majority of your DPS. This means it's difficult to scale up your team's damage because you're upgrading a character who doesn't contribute much to your total DPS, or because of the team split scaling will have a buff only affect part of your team, resulting in an overall smaller DPS gain than normal. But even then, upgrading from the Nodcry Craftable, Prospector Shovel, to our signature weapon isn't nearly as big of a DPS upgrade as it looks because of how much reaction bonus you already have on the team. And because Lunar-Charged takes a fraction of your team's contributions, a 40% team-wide buff will result in a smaller impact than you would expect. The main method of scaling your team's damage will come in the form of Constellations. Your main focus will be on upgrading either Ineffa or Bina. Upgrading Childe or your 4th won't nearly have as much impact until the much higher Constellations. As for who should your 4th be, here are my recommendations. The most notable 4th is Lauma, because she buffs the team through her Res Shred and adds Hyper Bloom for off-field DPS. This has some of the highest single target damage for this core. But the DPS will also take a hit against mobile or spread out enemies, as Ineffa can only trigger Hyper Bloom if the cores are nearby the enemy. The following characters will all have very similar performances. Sucrose has Res Shred and gives your team a lot of EM. As I mentioned before, EM buffing is the smallest form of upgrades for your lunar reactions. This will be your best free-to-play option, as Sucrose doesn't need much investment at all, just high EM and the VV set. Then we have Xilonen for the unconditional Res Shred and potential scroll bonus to both Hydro and Electro. This will help buff your otherwise unbuffed team, and she's good for wave content. Kazuha will be good for multi-target content, although Sucrose can also work, just less consistently due to requiring much more ER. Any off-field DPS character that's either Hydro or Electro will also work. This means Fischl, Auroron, Yai, Yelan, or Xingqiu, or Furina if you're feeling ambitious. High EM characters like Kuki will also work, but due to their low personal damage and fractional contribution to lunar charge, they tend to be a bit weaker than more traditional off-field DPS characters. And lastly, Sarah will also work, as she buffs Ineffa's crit damage with her C6, in addition to buffing Childe and Ineffa's attack, but this is not that much different in performance from the other previous options. Now, let's talk about the other Lunar-Charged Core, Ineffa Xilonen. The Ineffa Xilonen core focuses less on reaction damage and more on Childe's synergy with off-field DPS characters, while using the Hydro-Electro framework that Lunar-Charged creates to help improve the team's damage. You'll get a more traditional DPS split where every character contributes about the same amount to your total DPS, and compared to the previous Electro-Charged comps of old, this is a significant DPS improvement because Ineffa and Xilonen consolidates much more roles within the team. With this new Lunar-Charged core, we have much more flexibility in who we can pick for our 4th character. The biggest flaw with the old Electro-Charged comps was we didn't have enough damage because the damage was conditional. Our strongest Electro was Beidou, but she had awful single target damage and was best suited to fight exactly 2 enemies. This made her very impractical to use against most content. Then we have Fischl, who has the exact opposite problem. She is strongest against 1 enemy, but doesn't really help scale your damage for multi-target content. Together, they create a usable core that had Fischl coverage for single target and Beidou for multi-target, but in truth, the synergy was never truly there. Later on, Auroron was introduced and we finally had someone who could replace Beidou. Auroron offered about 70% of Fischl's DPS against single target, but also 70% of Beidou's DPS against multi-target, on top of being able to buff his team's damage by 40% with the scroll set. However, even with this potential upgrade, this still wasn't enough to make Electro-Charged comps strong enough to compete against Childe's more popular Vape teams. This was in part due to the lack of defenses on the team, as well as Auroron's inability to snapshot Bennett's buff, preventing a truly cohesive synergy. But with the Ineffa Xilonen core, we no longer have any of these issues. Ineffa covers single target and multi-target equally, while also having a pretty strong defensive shield. Xilonen covers the team's buffs with her Res Shred and the scroll set, and she adds another defensive layer to her team with her healing. This frees up our 4th to be any off-field DPS character in the game. We can slot in Fischl, Auroron, Beidou, Yai, Chiori, Yelan, Furina, or add Overload with Xiangling or Durin, or get Hyper Bloom with Lauma. Using other Dendro options is possible, but it will be more clunky to play. Unlike the Ineffa Bina core, this core follows a more normal DPS potential that has a weaker damage floor but also has a higher damage ceiling because there are more ways to scale up your damage. Both 5-star weapons and Constellations will improve your team's damage by quite a bit. However, due to using older characters, your 4th character's Constellations might not be worth heavily investing into. The biggest advantage of the Ineffa Xilonen core is how many of its teams don't rely on bursts for its DPS. You optimize your DPS by reducing your rotation time to be as short as possible. If you overextend your melee, you can use bursts to cover the extra downtime. For both of these cores, Childe will want to melee around 6 to 7 seconds. That's 4 cycles of 2 normals, followed by a charge attack if you dash cancel. Or if you have C1, you can add an additional 2 normal attacks after all that. If you don't use cancels, that's 1 less melee string. Now that we know a bit about both cores, how do they compare with each other? And is it worth putting primo investments into them? At the C0 4-star weapon budget, the Ineffa Bina core is significantly better than the Ineffa Xilonen core. As I mentioned before, The Bina core relies mostly on reaction damage, and the main way to scale up reaction damage is through levels. But after you've achieved level 90, it becomes much harder to scale your team's DPS higher. At the C0R1 budget range, many of the teams in the Ineffa Xilonen core begin to match or outperform the Ineffa Bina core. While it's technically more expensive, the main advantage is that you get to use characters you've already invested and built. At this budget range, both cores will be performing similarly in numbers, with the only exception being the Ineffa Bina Lauma team, which performs slightly higher. Beyond that, both cores don't scale particularly amazing by modern standards, so further investment isn't optimal unless you really like the characters used. C2 Ineffa Bina is a good stopping port for the Ineffa Bina core, while investment in the Ineffa Xilonen core will depend on the team. Childe's C1 will be a big quality of life for both of these teams, while C3, C4, and C6 will be useful for the Ineffa Xilonen core, but will have barely an effect for the Ineffa Bina core. Some notable constellations for the Ineffa Xilonen core are C1 Chiori, C1 Yai, and Durin C1 and C2. So in conclusion, the Ineffa Bina core is now the most cost-efficient Childe team to date. You get the DPS of a team that would normally require 5-star weapons, using 4-star ones. But the downside is the team doesn't scale much higher from there. It has a really good damage floor, but limited damage ceiling. Another downside is you need to farm essentially 3 new artifact sets from scratch to achieve this level of DPS, which can take months of grinding, ignoring the fact that you'll also want to farm and build future characters later down the road. The Ineffa Xilonen core can be used as a transition point to the Ineffa Bina core if you don't want to use Aino, or you can put some vertical investment to allow it to stand on its own 2 feet. It plays more like a traditional Childe team and performs similarly as well. The open nature of the flex slot allows for some interesting combinations of synergy that normally isn't possible with other Childe teams. If I had to rank these teams with other Childe teams, this is how I would rate them. At the super free-to-play budget range, with C0 and no 5-star weapons, Ineffa Bina ranks first, followed by Freeze or Vape, depending on if you prefer comfy gameplay or if you're willing to learn the tech required to elevate Vape teams to a higher DPS, with the Ineffa Xilonen core being ranked at the bottom. At the C0R1 budget range, I would rank Freeze as the best due to wheelchair comps like Skirk super elevating the team's DPS, followed by Vape for a similar reason as Freeze, but with Mavwika. But if you ignore these outliers, I would rank Ineffa Bina Laumas first due to the layering synergy of Lunar-Charged and Hyperbloom, followed by Vape and Freeze at the same tier, then other Ineffa Bina teams, then Ineffa Xilonen. But if you don't use the dedicated Nod Cry sets, it would be ranked as Vape and Freeze, followed by Lauma, then Ineffa Xilonen, and then the rest of the Ineffa Bina teams. And then this is where it gets interesting. At the C1R1 budget range, again ignoring the outliers, Ineffa Xilonen is first, followed by Freeze and Vape at the same tier, then Ineffa Bina. Ineffa Xilonen gets a massive power spike from C1 characters, more so than other teams. For C2 and beyond, I don't think my opinions matter anymore, because if you've gotten this far, you must have really liked the teams or characters to put that many polls into them. The top spot will entirely depend on personal preferences. If you're looking for big numbers with big damage spikes, Vape's got you covered. If you're looking for comfy gameplay, Freeze is where it's at. Both of the Lunar-Charged teams will be ranking on the bottom due to weak constellations or limited scaling. The main takeaway, I guess, would be most of the Childe teams are quite similar in performance, with the exceptions being the 2 wheelchair comps being a tier above the rest. So, if you don't plan to pull beyond C0, or you don't plan to pull into the weapon banner very often, the Ineffa Bina core is a very good team to use. But if you can afford to pull for higher constellations, or to gear out your team with 5-star weapons, Ineffa Xilonen is a good contender alongside Vape and Freeze. And if you plan to get C2 or higher, Lunar-Charged teams aren't recommended, and you'll be wanting to look into a Freeze or Vape team if you want optimum efficiency. Of course, don't let that stop you from using teams and characters you enjoy playing. The best thing for your account is to have fun. If you really enjoy the fantasy of playing Delusion Childe, shoot for the moon and upgrade your Lunar-Charged team. Enjoy yourself, because that's the only thing that really matters. And that's everything I want to talk about for this video. If you like my content or ended up liking the video, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel for more Genshin content, share with a friend, and leave a comment down below on which team you like playing the most. With that, bye bye!